Today, I'm going to be talking about my research on taking a teen-centered approach to online safety, but tailoring that to the specific audience of autistic youth. So, when we think about online safety, we usually think about it through what I call fear-based narratives. For instance, the news articles that we see in the headlines saying that our kids are at risk of cyberbullying and suicide and sextortion and all of these really horrible things that put them in harm's way. Now, the immediate reaction when we see all of these dangers that are being presented to our youth is this sense of fear, where we want to just protect them and shield them at all costs because they're our babies and they're our kids. But at the same time, one thing we have to realize is that when we make decisions based on fear, we often aren't making the best or the most rational decisions. If we make decisions based on fear, we build walls and we take away opportunities instead of finding ways to protect our kids while giving them the opportunity to benefit from what the internet can afford them. So, with this idea of we must protect teens from online dangers at all costs, we tend to believe this assumption that online dangers are this pandemic that are plaguing our youth, and seeing it as this end all be all thing that we need to protect our teens from. We can see evidence of this in the news media, the trials of Meta and the Facebook files. We can see it with all these large class action lawsuits against social media companies because of the problems with mental health in our youth. But the problem is when we take this reactive fear-based approach, we often resort to the things that make us feel safe and take abstinence-only based approaches, meaning restricting all and every technology use, because otherwise we don't know how to protect them. But the problem in doing this is when we restrict any and all access to technology as a way to protect our youth, we're not giving them the opportunities to use technologies in beneficial ways. For instance, my daughter was traumatized by the public school system because she was just overwhelmed every day and it wasn't giving her the challenge that she needed in school. And one of the things that she told me was, Mom, when a teacher raises her voice, it makes me feel safe on Zoom because I can just mute or I can just leave the room for a little bit and then I can rejoin when I feel safe again. And hearing these narratives from our kids is really important to see how the internet can provide social outlets that are possibly not available to our youth in person. And what do we know about abstinence-only approaches to other risk behavior like sex? Is generally they don't work. And so we need to be more practical about protecting youth from these serious risks. At the same time, when we think about these problems, we often think that any risk exposure online is bad. Instead of seeing the internet and social media as a way to scaffold social learning for our youth in a way that might be even safer than doing some of these things offline. For instance, developing friendships and being able to teach some basic communication skills through out-school classes or just small groups. Give our kids an opportunity to kind of get their feet wet and use technology and connect with others in ways that maybe aren't as overwhelming to them. And finally, if we use a risk-based approach to just protect and isolate, what we're doing is not giving our kids the opportunity to learn and to become independent and free-thinking adults. I know just as a mom with a 2E daughter, one of my biggest goals in life is that she can live a happy, well-adjusted, and independent life when she grows up. And I know that many of you probably want that for your children as well. So the statement here is that we need to strike this middle ground between protecting our teens from online dangers and teaching them how to cope with these themselves. So going from these fear-based narratives that we often see in the news, I want to report on some evidence-based research that we did with teens. The first study that I'm going to talk about is a study that we did with 68 parents and teens, teens between the ages of 13 and 17. And we did not at the time ask any questions regarding neurodiversity or disability. But I would say that this is a representative sample, so I do believe that there were some youth who would fit that profile in this study. But I'm presenting on this result from this general teen population to kind of show that we have this shared moral dilemma and the same struggles, regardless if our teens are on the spectrum or not. So from the study, some of the things that we found were that 87% of the risks that parents and teens reported during the study were only low to medium risk severity. Low, such as seeing an inappropriate photo and then kind of just moving on, to medium of being asked for maybe an illicit photo and also moving on. 84% of the risks reported suggested that the teens did not intentionally seek out the online risk experiences. Now, this counters that narrative that teens are stupid and thrill-seeking and want to encounter these risk experiences. Also, almost half of the reports showed that the teens took active measures to cope. For instance, by saying no to unwanted advances, confronting people who caused the issue, removing themselves from unwanted situations, or seeking help from an adult. Another 49% of the reports were considered resolved within the week that they were reported, with 17% of them being so insignificant that teens told us, yeah, that just happens online. And these experiences often gave teens the opportunity to build important social skills, such as boundary negotiation, communicating different thoughts and opinions with others, problem solving, and even empathy, because they were able to provide support to others within their network. So some of the quotes that we got from this diary study can really show some of the trends that we saw in this study. First, one thing that we learned is that teens see more online than we as adults think. A 15-year-old female told us, "Oh, hun, it's the internet. Half of it's porn to start with. The other half is contaminated by violent material, illegal material, depression, anxiety, and morally dubious events by nature. You know, it would be really a miracle if you managed to be on the internet without any exposure to it." So really, this just sheds light on some of the things that we might not anticipate that our youth are seeing online if we kind of take the rose-colored glasses approach. But it also tells us that we need to be educating our youth to prepare them from some of these things that they're not necessarily seeking out, but they may come across. For instance, self-harm was one of the common things that teens in the study encountered. And this study occurred before Instagram instituted its guidelines on self-harm and sensitivity filters. A 13-year-old female said, "Someone posted an Instagram picture of their scars. I commented, stay strong, but one comment will not save your life." So again, this just shows some of the hard and heavy things that our youth are encountering online that we need to be ready to have these conversations with them. Another thing that we often don't see in the news headlines is that most of the teens who participated in this study, when they were asked for that naked picture of themselves, they mostly said no. And they kind of took this as par for the course. And especially if it was a stranger, they had no qualms about setting those boundaries. And so that should be something that helps us parents kind of rest assured that, you know, they're not always falling victim to some of these dangers online. At the same time, we also have to acknowledge that sometimes when these encounters happened, teens said yes. For instance, a 16-year-old male in this study explained, "Well, a friend of mine was feeling particularly sexual, and it showed in her text. Well, it's not like I planned it, but I certainly wasn't opposed to it." Now, sometimes when we see comments like this, the hair on the back of our neck starts to raise and we start to freak out a little bit. But maybe I just want to push back a little bit and remind you of what you were doing as a 16-year-old youth. And it might have been online or offline, depending on the generation you came from, but realizing that 16 is one of the developmentally appropriate times to seek some kind of sexual exploration. but maybe making sure that teens are doing so in healthy ways. And less often, but it did happen, things got serious. There was one situation where a 14-year-old girl had a boy ask her for a naked picture. She sent that picture, and then the boy sent it around to the rest of her school to the point that she was being bullied and expressed suicidal thoughts. The interesting thing about this case, though, was that the parent was aware that the girl sent a picture, but the girl told her that it was a fake picture. And so this is an example of sometimes there's a disconnect between what parents know and what teens are doing online. So it's really important to encourage those open conversations with our kids and make sure that we're being supportive so that they're not dealing with these types of situations on their own. So in the study, what was most concerning is that most of the parents were in the dark. Family communication regarding teens' online risk experiences was poor and created significant differences in perceptions between parents and teens on what really happened. For instance, less than 7% of the risk reported in the study, because teens and parents reported separately each week, matched between what parents reported versus what teens reported. 38% of the parent-teen pairs had no communication regarding the online risks that teens reported each week. And parental misconceptions, as well as their actual responses, made the situation worse to the point that teens were telling us during the study that they would not want to go to their parents if they needed help with something that happened online. So let's unpack this a little bit more. So when parents were involved, parents sometimes used active mediation to talk about the situation with their teens and help them solve it. But what we found from the teens' perspective is that these conversations often sounded more like a lecture or punishment. For instance, one mother of a 15-year-old male, when he was talking about playing a video game, she told us, "I think it's childish and ridiculous, a waste of time. He's actually watching me type this, so he knows how I feel about it." But the sad thing is, a couple weeks later, the teen reported that he was looking up intoxication levels of marijuana. And when we asked, like, is this something you talked with your parent about? He obviously said, of course not. There's another situation that we saw where a 13-year-old mother of a 13-year-old female set a very strict rule of her daughter to not send any pictures to boys. And here we see it in a situation where a girl sent a boy a picture of herself, but it was just a picture of herself smiling, not anything sexual, and she was put under restriction because of it. It's these situations where the tensions and the conflicts between parents and teens became almost unproductive in the process of helping teens deal with some of these online situations effectively and put kind of stress in the relationship between teens and their parents. So some of the reasons why teens told us that they didn't tell their parents about what was going online was because, one, oftentimes teens saw these experiences as no big deal. For instance, the teen here was kicking, which that's a platform that no longer exists, and received a dick pic and said that, well, mom, it wasn't a big deal, and I didn't tell my mom because I would have never told her something like this and how she would have acted. Parents would another reason was that parents, according to teens, would cause unnecessary awkwardness. They would probably act like it was unusual because they aren't exposed to it as much. They'd probably follow up on it and would just be a lot of unnecessary awkwardness over a non-existent problem. And then finally, because parents would overreact, punish them, or make things worse. She would probably make me come off of that social network platform, and I didn't tell her because I shouldn't be in trouble because somebody else made the wrong choice or mistake. So as you can see here, teens are having these difficult conversations with themselves on whether or not they should tell their parents or not. And with the cost benefit ratio, they're really coming up on the side of, well, it's better to not tell my parents because I'm worried about getting in trouble. So at the end of the 2-month diary study, one of the significant effects we found was that parents reported significantly lower levels of family communication than in their pre-surveys, realizing that they really didn't have a good sense of what their teens were doing online. But yet, their levels of family communication that parents reported was still higher than that reported by their teens. From matched reports from the same dyad, mother of a 14-year-old and a 14, is that I realized that I've given my daughter a lot of trust, whereas the 14-year-old put it as that my parents don't really know what I do online, no matter how much they really think they know. So these are real accounts from real parents and teens about some of the struggles that they have online. And one of the reasons I present this is that I'm sure that many of you feel some of these same struggles. Some of the questions, again, I'll answer those really quickly, is one, that this study was not specific to youth on the spectrum. It was a general population of teens, so I'm sure there were some who were neurodiverse. And then, yes, we will share the recordings later on. So next, I want to present some collaborative work that I did with Dr. Sinru Page. She's at Brigham Young University. And I've included links to all of the published papers as well as to her research lab as well. We did an ethnographic study that involved 22 individuals, including autistic young adults who had level 2 support needs, their parents, and support staff. We're trying to understand some of the struggles that were specific to youth who were on the spectrum so that we could see if some of the research from my teen studies was generalizable to this population or how it differed. For this study, we engaged with 2 different organizations in the northeastern United States that provided service to those on the spectrum who had significant support needs. First, we studied the benefits and risk of social media use. Yes, I agree. Autistic youth are not the same as neurotypical youth. And I think that's really important to acknowledge that, but also see where some of the struggles are similar and that we can work together to protect youth as a whole. All right. So we studied the benefits and risks of social media use through the lens of affordances. Affordances are how people perceive how to use objects, such as whether or not a door should be pushed or pulled to be opened. Similarly, a button is to be clicked and a scroll bar is to be used to scroll. So the way that we interpret these cues is the way that how we interact with our environment. All right. So the first thing that we found from this study were some of the benefits as well as some of the risks of using social media among this population of autistic young adults. The first was the ability to maintain existing relationships, even though there was physical distance, because sometimes creating and fostering friendships or other relationships is hard for our kids on the spectrum. And as an example from one of the participants from the study is they said, I can contact family members on Facebook that live far away from me, family that I don't usually see, and they're too far for me to go visit. So being able to have those social connections, even though there was physical distance. Another reason that social media was considered beneficial was that it helped reduce boredom and it helped them pursue some of their special interests and meet like-minded people that they could share these interests with instead of trying to share these interests with others who did not also share them with them. And then also we found that it was a good way for the autistic young adults to seek new relationships. But at the same time, this was sometimes a double-edged sword because it was difficult to read the social cues on whether or not the other people that they wanted to connect with wanted to connect with them. That led to some of the drawbacks of social media use, which included increased anxiety due to social expectations. Even though the internet in some way seems safer because we're sitting behind a computer screen and there's more explicit cues like friend or not friend, as we all know, the social cues on social media are different than in the real world. And they're sometimes just as confusing, if not more, because the people that we're interacting with are more varied than who we interact with on a daily basis. This also led to some severe instances of online harassment and social drama because the cues from the autistic young adults were misinterpreted by those they were trying to interact with, and vice versa. There was also concerns about oversharing and privacy concerns, both from the perspective of the young autistic adults and those that they were interacting with. Another quote from a participant was, "I don't like it when people give negative comments or post something inappropriate, something like really immature, something that's more like insensitive or can be considered like harassment in a way." Now, many of our autistic youth are very sensitive to social drama and to negative comments. And when they see these online, they take them to heart. And instead of being able to move on, they might ruminate over them and cause them additional anxiety, even if they're not part of that particular conversation. So, being understanding on how this could lead to some overstimulation and being overwhelmed and helping them co-regulate about some of those situations is important. Some of the other findings from this study is that young autistic adults perceive the affordances of social media differently than what we would expect from the neurotypical users of social media. For instance, when sharing content, they often assumed a single audience or a single purpose. For instance, when somebody posted something on their newsfeed just to their general list of friends, oftentimes the autistic participant would interpret that they were saying that directly to them and respond in a way that might not have been what was expected by the person who was sharing. Also, the opportunity came where sometimes the autistic young adults overshared information about others because they were not aware that it was something that the other person didn't want to share, and that also caused interpersonal conflicts. And oftentimes, the affordances of social media were taken at face value. So oftentimes these individuals shared as they were prompted to do, which created this level of oversharing. In terms of connecting with others, social media did help maintain positive relationships, but sometimes friendship was interpreted too literally. So since somebody was somebody's Facebook friend, they thought that they should have access to them and that they should act like friends as one would in real life. And that wasn't always the case with some of the people that these individuals were friends with. And then the boundaries were often very rule based. So if somebody felt like, oh, you shouldn't post this, and somebody violated that boundary, then it was difficult for the young autistic adults to process why somebody would do something that was not appropriate on social media. Also, when consuming content, this sometimes led to addictive consumption. Maybe getting overly interested in a narrow subject or obsessive compulsive activities, for instance, with pornography. And they also trusted content that was posted at face value instead of thinking about it from the possibility of being fake news or misinformation. Also, when they had networked interactions, a benefit was that it enabled social engagement with larger communities of people with shared interests, and being able to connect with more like individuals, but also sometimes strangers and people who had malicious intent. And when interacting with people, sometimes the participants from our study were hurt because they expected immediate responses, like when the platform said that somebody was online, and felt shunned or ignored when the person didn't reply right in a timely manner. And this generally was related to difficulty interpreting the intentions of others in a way that facilitated these social interactions. So here's an example of how the affordances of social media were interpreted a little differently than how some of us might interpret them. For instance, I thought I was her friend, but she said, well, you're not because we don't know each other well enough. Again, taking that literal interpretation of when somebody sends a friend request that they're now a friend. And the staff member at one of the autism support organizations explained, well, they have a hard time telling the difference between a Facebook friend and a real friend. You're friends on Facebook, but that's not really what it is. Another example here is a screenshot from my Facebook where it says, "What's on your mind, Pamela?" Well, interpreted literally, that is an invitation to share what's on my mind. But not realizing that sometimes we need to have a filter, especially in public, semi-public spaces. One of the staff members talked about how I've got clients that are writing horrible threats and going on Facebook at night and saying things that they really shouldn't, like "I hate my job" or "I hate this person." So again, social media encourages this frictionless sharing and transparency, which in some ways is beneficial and positive to be our authentic selves. But at the same time, we know that there's a fine line between what we share publicly and what we should keep to those in our trusted circles. And so navigating that social nuance was often difficult for the participants of our study. And one of the reasons that we framed this study around the affordances of social media is that we didn't want to take a deficit-based approach of saying that the autistic young adults were at fault and they were the ones making these mistakes. Because as you can see here, social media is full of confusing social cues. And if you try to interpret some of these and you have that literal interpretation and you don't know the unwritten social cues, you can imagine some of the confusion that it causes. So if social media tells you to write something, to write a comment, to write an answer, well, why would somebody get mad when you do that? So here a participant said, well, I had to do that. I had to share my phone number because when I made an account, it said to add my phone number or email. So instead of taking that as an opportunity to maybe falsify some of the information to protect their privacy, they took that at face value that they needed to share. Another participant said, well, sometimes people come back on and say, well, why did you message me so many times? And then it's awkward. It's like, I don't know what to say to this. Another participant, when they saw that somebody was active online, but they sent them a message and they ghosted them, said, well, why hasn't this person responded yet? And again, that caused that social anxiety of, is this person ignoring me or do they not like me? A staff member also commented on how one participant said, oh, this is my girlfriend. And he would show them an online account of someone that looked like a model and seemed very false. Like it was definitely really difficult for him to kind of process that just because someone posted that picture doesn't mean that's what they really look like. And so again, I just want to emphasize that social media and the way it's designed isn't really designed for neurodiverse or autistic users who may take some of the cues of social media literally instead of seeing them for what they are on a platform that's trying to promote more sharing and more engagement, almost to an addictive level, instead of doing what's in their own best interest. So we've also recently looked at how the support network of parents, support staff, and extended family helped mediate the social media use for the autistic young adults. What we found a lot was that oftentimes when the young autistic adult got into more serious trouble, they had technology taken away from them. The support people often gave informal advice and feedback, but in some rare cases, they also provided some formal training and curriculum on the appropriate use of social media. While others also used additional approaches to monitor the young autistic adults in the study, as well as using parental control software to be able to keep tabs on what they were doing online. Some of the benefits and drawbacks of this mediation is that the young autistic adults often requested opportunities for joint troubleshooting, which helped reinforce appropriate social behaviors in these situations. Unfortunately, this was almost seen as overwhelming to the parents and support staff because they felt like some of these situations were being overshared with the wrong people. And that led to some judgment of the participants that was probably more negative than it should have been. Another benefit is that the mediation provided direct support for emotional co-regulation, to be able to think about something negative that was shared on social media and not taking up those emotions and taking them on themselves and being able to regulate for the rest of the day. Another major finding from this study is that even though the autistic youth were really forthcoming about sharing their problems and their struggles and their online activities with their support networks, the one time when they started to not do this was when they perceived that they were going to get punished for sharing and for what happened online. In this case, they often went into defense mode and started hiding their online behaviors from their support network. So again, this is a good encouragement that we want to make sure to be open and supportive instead of taking that more punishment orientation. And then overall, one of the things that we saw that is a controversy, and it's also something that it all depends on the particular individual, because if you meet one autistic person, you've met one autistic person. Everybody has different strengths and weaknesses, and so there's no one size fits all solution. But what we did see in general is that there was this over reliance on support networks because there was a lack of formal training on how to use social media. And so instead of trying to do some self regulation and independent problem solving, a lot of times these youth relied on their support networks. And it reminded me of the metaphor of like, you give a man a fish and he eats for a day. You teach a man how to fish and he can eat for a lifetime. And so really trying to move to that that sense of being able to transition from adolescence to adulthood, even for our artistic young adults, to be able to manage some of these situations on their own and do so in an empowering and well-informed way. So this was a lot. And again, there's no magic bullet or one size fits all solution, but there are some general things that we can do to handle some of these situations. So first, we should not consider giving our teens technology and access to social media and the internet as a trust or a privilege. Instead, we should see it as a responsibility and also our responsibility to teach. For instance, would you just give your 16-year-old kid the keys to your car and say, go at it and drive? But once you get into a wreck, I'm going to take away those keys in the car and you're never going to get to drive again. Well, unfortunately, that's what many of us are doing with even younger children, giving them tablets or giving them cell phones and saying, well, once you've broken my trust, all bets are off. So instead of thinking of as like giving our children access to technology without any kind of training, we should think about it, the idea that they are going to get into a wreck if we don't teach them the proper ways to use social media and the internet or their phones in a way that is consistent with our family values. So it's not a matter of trusting your child until they prove to be untrustworthy. It's actually scaffolding those skills, creating boundaries and setting rules and guidelines so that they can learn how to engage with others through technology safety. Being able to use the internet safely is a learned skill. Also, it's really important that we need to support and listen to our youth instead of taking on kind of this authoritarian approach that is more punishment oriented, because that's really where neurotypical teens, as well as the autistic young adults in both studies, really started pulling back and hiding what they're doing online from others. So online safety should become a part of everyday discussions for developing social emotional skills. For instance, how to deal with a bully. For mental health education, because our youth are seeing really hard stuff online about self-harm and depression and anxiety. And they could really go down this rabbit hole without understanding how to deal with some of these things that they're seeing online. Instead of treating some of the online behaviors like sexting between youth as completely deviant behavior, starting to incorporate safe sexting behaviors into sex education, talking about the addictive nature of pornography and how to form healthy relationships and how to set safe boundaries when interacting with others in sexual ways that involve the internet. Um, we don't want to treat online risks as any more deviant than typical risks that teens encounter online or offline. Because if we do, again, we're resorting to that abstinence-only approach that our teens are going to think isn't realistic, and they're going to just not listen to anything we have to say. So instead, give practical advice on how to do things safely and to keep themselves safe. So in our studies, one of the things that we often saw is that teens actually wanted to communicate with their parents, but they weren't comfortable in doing so because they felt like they were going to be judged or punished. So really giving them that opportunity and engaging with them with a sense of curiosity, even though it's really, really hard to do. Because we want what's in their best interest. And we know sometimes the decisions that they make online don't follow course with that. Here's just a quotation from a 15-year-old female showing that, you know, our kids are getting involved in sexting situations. It's pretty commonplace. And so if we're not having these discussions with them, then they're really going to not know how to navigate these situations or have an exit strategy. We also need to consider online safety as a developmental process. I like to give the analogy here of first having your kids start with a bike that has training wheels, teaching them how to use it, and then slowly taking those training wheels off so that they can to navigate how to ride a bike on their own. So when you first introduce technology to your kids, that's really when you want to lock it down and set up parental controls and do a lot of joint co-monitoring of what they're doing online. For instance, we have Google Family Link on my daughter's phone, and she knows that we can sit with her at any time to look at the things that she's doing, and we have access to all of her accounts. But the ages of, you know, to the age 14, teaching them some of these skills for how to navigate potentially risky situations online. Give them a hypothetical example of, well, what if somebody sent you a message that they wanted you to send them a picture of yourself naked? What would you do? And then really just talking through some of those strategies so that they know how to respond if that happens to them. And then by the age of 15 or 16, again, this is for neurotypical youth, and depending on the level of support needed by your teen, this may vary. But trust them to make some good decisions because you're a good parent, you've taught them well, and to set their own clear boundaries. But always make sure that you let them know that you're there to help in case they get in trouble, and that you're there to support them and get them out of trouble instead of putting them in trouble. So some guidelines for choosing the right parental control software is one that you want to make sure that the app isn't overly restrictive. For instance, giving parents the ability to see every text message or message that's sent and received to all individuals. Another guideline is to make sure that the app considers your teen's privacy. Because to some extent, as teens are developing and maturing into adults, they do need a little bit of privacy to navigate some of their friendships or even romantic partnerships. Make sure that the app facilitates open communication and trust. For instance, it's not one that has to be hidden covertly, and that there's established communication patterns between the parent and the teen. And make the teen part of the decision. Buy-in here really matters because if you go behind your teen's back to spy on them and they find that out, then trust can be broken. They really want to know that you trust them and that you're there for them, instead of it being a situation where there's no trust and that it just turns into a hiding situation. And then also, don't be fooled. There's no parental control app on the market that can guarantee that your teen will be safe online, um, and that you still need to be vigilant in knowing and being part of their everyday lives to be able to navigate some of these situations. For instance, one of the things that I do with my daughter at the end of every day, we do two two good things that happened in a day and one negative thing, just so we can share about our day and keep a good temperature reading on how we're doing. And the reason that I say this is we did a study where we scraped the app reviews from Google Play, and we saw that many of the reviews for parental control apps were actually left by teens. And they had very vocal opinions about how parental control apps could potentially harm the parent-teen relationship, saying that teens could become more defiant, resorting to burner phones um, to get around overprotective parenting. They said that the apps were too privacy invasive, taking away all the privacy and turning their parents into stalkers. And then also just because that breach in the trust relationship, kids were very vocal in saying that these apps often made them grow farther apart from their parents. If they don't trust me, then why should I trust them? So this is just a word of caution. We want to keep our kids safe and keep tabs on what they're doing online, but at the same time, we want to be able to promote some healthy autonomy and self-regulation and give them some level of privacy so that they can learn how to handle some lower level risk situations on their own. So just in closing, one of the things that I like to say is that we should resist fear-based narratives. Yeah, I'm scared. And we should all be scared about some of the things that are happening online. And there are kids that are really vulnerable to these risks. But at the same time, we can't deny some of the benefits that technology affords our youth. And according to Dr. Odgers, who's one of my mentors, it may be time for adults to stop arguing over whether or not smartphones and social media are good or bad for teens' mental health, and instead start figuring out best ways to support them both in their offline and online lives so that um, they can thrive. This research is supported by the William T. Grant Foundation as well as the National Science Foundation. However, all of the opinions from the research are that of the researchers and not our sponsors. And I would love to give you an opportunity to ask questions, and we can go from there. This is my email address if anybody wants to contact me. The research that I presented today is on my STIR Lab website under Adolescent Online Safety. And then the autism research that's going on with my friend, Dr. Page, here's the link there for her autism and social media project that's currently ongoing. All right, thanks everybody. So it looks like there's a chat and then there's a Q&A. So those of you who posted in the chat, if you could go ahead and post over in the Q&A, then I can look in one place, and that would be really appreciated. So moderator, if you want to help me, do I need to push answer live or type answer? I guess I can just push answer live.
Yeah, no, you don't need to do that. You can just read them and answer them.
Okay.
And then I'll dismiss them for you as we go.
All right, great. Thank you so much. So do you recommend some do-don'ts for young adults to decode social cues? You know, that's a really great question. And there's probably too many for me to go over a talk right now. But some of the things that have been helpful for my family is there's an evidence-based program by UCLA called the PEERS program that helps decode some social cues. And then I've actually been going to Outschool and doing some of the classes there about unspoken social rules. So that my daughter can benefit from some of those. There are also a lot of support groups online that again, I would be careful and monitor. There's a forum called Wrong Planet where a lot of autistic adults and young adults provide support to one another. But again, there's a lot of varied opinions out there, and so you want to keep tabs on where your kids are getting advice and whether or not that advice jives with your family values. So let's see, another one. So do you have any data regarding the percentage of autistic young adults that use social media? Unfortunately, I don't. And then the other thing on that is I don't know if we really, as a society, have good data on how many young adults um, are actually on the spectrum because there's so many people who don't get diagnosed into adulthood, and it's really those who have more significant support needs that get earlier diagnosis. I've seen some statistics out there, but I think I'm somewhat skeptical of them. Of like 90% of autistic adults are under or unemployed. But at the same time, I think there's a lot of individuals who um, would be diagnosed on the spectrum that uh, do work and have productive lives as well. So I don't know if statistics is something that I want to go by because we still have a dearth of information in accurate diagnoses. Where can we find formal training on social media use? I think that's a great question. There's websites like commonsensemedia.org. There's also FOSI, the Family Online Safety Institute. Um, if you go to OutSchool, there's a number of classes held for neurodiverse kids with autism or ADHD. I think they're really just pockets that you can find them. And many times you just want to vet them to make sure that they're safe places to send your kids as well. Um, let's see if I'm right. So one thing from one comment is that 9 out of 10 autistic women have been victims of sexual violence. And even with education, our autistic daughters cannot generalize from one situation or another. They don't say no because they think everyone is doing it, right? And so, one strength of our autistic kids is that they're really transparent and you can talk to them really directly about things that some kids would just be embarrassed about. And so having these direct conversations are really important to have and debunking some of the myths of, not everybody's doing it. And you're right, that shift in context, in the context blindness of translating from one situation to another is really hard for our kiddos. So some suggestions that I have is have two different types of rules. One, the hard set, like always never type of rules, like never send somebody a naked picture of yourself online. Never meet somebody who you met online offline, but then without first getting my permission or letting me know. Okay. Because like I know a lot of autistic youth who have met some of their best friends and some of their partners through online means, and that's more commonplace. I actually met my husband, who's on the spectrum, on Match.com, and so it's important to have boundaries that are permeable, meaning that they can shift, but knowing when they can shift and maybe getting the advice from a loved one to how to make that meeting in public or safe or bringing somebody along with you instead of making it this all or nothing situation. I'm on one forum on Facebook where a mother was complaining about how her adult son, who was on the spectrum, was engaging in porn. And the comment that I made was, he's an adult and he has sexual needs. And so maybe helping him find healthier outlets other than porn instead of just trying to like shut down and lock down the computer to restrict porn. So being able to healthily address those legitimate adult and appropriate needs in a way that's healthy and relationship seeking instead of going into some patterns that might be easier but not as healthy for their development. Somebody's working on a research project with children on the spectrum in Rwanda. That's awesome. Loved if you reach out. That'd be great. So unfortunately, connecting with others is dangerous to our young autistic adults who have no friends in real life, and they're drawn to welcoming online and extreme groups. And that's true, they are, because as humans, we all need some level of belonging and social connection. So really, as parents, one of our jobs is to help them find those those healthy groups to connect with. Oftentimes, that might be peer-based groups based on special interests like coding or theater, because it's really important to form those relationships. Please have you parental control software examples? Yeah, there's several out there. Google Family Link is one that you can use on Android devices. Bark is currently the leader for social media monitoring. But again, just be careful and have these conversations with your teens so that it doesn't just create more conflict and tension in your household. So I'm an SLP from India, and we have trouble explaining to parents about sex because it's still considered taboo. How and where do we start? We understand this is part of development, and autistics need this too. Yeah, I have done some work with Indian populations, and they do tend to have a more like restrictive, authoritarian mentality about protecting their youth. I really think that having these conversations and maybe doing a similar diary study or researchers showing that these are things that are already happening and so that we need to address it is probably the best way to open people's eyes to new ways and thoughts in addressing these topics. So what age do you think it's appropriate for an autistic teen or tween to get their first smartphone? Again, this is solely up to the parent. And there are a few different factors that can be thought about. So my daughter is 8, going on 9, and she has a smartphone. We have it locked down with parental controls. She doesn't use it all the time. We keep it in our room at night. But the reason we got it is she has a large level of social anxiety, to the extent that I need to call her and be on the phone when I'm going to put away the grocery cart and she's in the car. So in some sense, having a digital device is a way to protect our kids and give them a sense of independence. For instance, if they go on a play date and they need a quick exit strategy. But also, not all smartphones are the same. There's Verizon smartwatches out there that are locked down, and you can set only a specific list of contacts. So starting out with some of those more limited technologies to, again, scaffold learning to teach them how to use that responsibly until they can go to the next level, would be my suggestion. Because one of the things that I've seen with autistic kids and teens is that they often learn by example rather than through just their intuitive nature of like, oh, well, I've never done this before. Let me try this. But leading by example and being taught more formally, like explicit social rules, is more important. And doing that through modeling and practice is really important as well. Somebody talked about developing an internet use contract before allowing a child to use the internet. And I think that's actually a really great idea. But again, doing it earlier on, not retroactively once there's already a problem. And then making sure that it's balanced, where there's responsibilities for both the parent and for the child. One of the things that I've seen so much in my research is that kids call us out as hypocrites because I'm addicted to my mobile phone more than my daughter is. And she'll tell me, Mom, you can't tell me to get off my phone if you're not getting off of it. So we need to practice what we preach so that we're leading by example. So can you please comment on any research evidence-based information on social media online use being addictive for adolescents with ASD, especially in light of restrictive repetitive behaviors that are common with the ASD profile? So yes, there is research, but generally there's research on social media and smartphones being addictive for all of us. But at the same time, restricting use and just cutting it off cold turkey isn't always the best solution either. There are apps for productivity control. There's even evidence-based research showing that there's a setting on YouTube to turn off autoplay. And just by using that setting, children who are studied consumed significantly fewer hours of YouTube because that setting was on. So just having a little bit of friction, such as on our phones, we can set reminders or warnings on Facebook and Instagram when we've used our own phones for over 3 hours. Or we can turn on night mode to change the screen to not as high resolution. Many of those things are practices that we as adults, as well as neurotypical teens, as well as those with ASD, putting in those good practices for developing healthy digital habits is something that's beneficial for all of us. So what happens if a young adult is using YouTube to look for videos that were sexually arousing, but they were not pornographic related though? How to manage this and still allow to have a phone? And again, this comes to family values. One thing that we don't want to do is treat young autistic adults as if they're children just because maybe um, developmentally, mentally, they might be at that level because physically they are and have some of the same sexual needs as adults. And so respecting that need and having frank conversations about what that is and how to handle those urges in ways that are more positive and beneficial. And I think having those frank conversations about how pornography victimizes certain people and can lead to unhealthy sexual experiences for adults. And again, we can talk to the evidence-based research for general populations, not just those on the spectrum. I love your analogy about teaching appropriate social media use and driving a car. Did you find the autistic teens in your work were understood to the differences between trust versus responsibility? Um, so I think um, autistic youth have a easier time understanding rule-based systems that focus on accountability and responsibility rather than this squishy concept of trust. Because trust implies some level of social norms and acceptability, and that if we don't have those same social norms, me violating trust might be unintended and unexpected. So, for instance, um, people need to communicate to set boundaries on whether or not they want a picture shared. Um, and so being more explicit about some of these cues is really important. Um, I've worked with a number of autistic students as a professor in the university setting, some who disclose their status, and others that you just know. And so being able to adjust your teaching style as well as your parenting style to use more direct declarative language and less social nuance is really important, especially for the youth who have a harder time interpreting those unspoken social cues. And let's see if there's So are there any courses developed that teach social media skills, such as peers, specifically for social cues for social media? I am not aware of anything specific to ASD kiddos. I would take a look at an OutSchool because I have found some just general social skills classes there. And then my colleague, Dr. Page at BYU, is starting a project to create some more formalized curriculum for social media use for those on the spectrum. Sorry, I'm just scrolling now to make sure I caught most things. All right, I think I caught everybody's questions, but if I didn't catch yours and you still want to ask it, please go ahead and submit again, just so it pops up at the end for me. And then I can go ahead and speak it out. Otherwise, you all are welcome to reach out to me by email or visit my lab website where I have all my published papers and the things that we're doing for our future work.